I snapped at my best friend for tolerating her fiance's inappropriate behavior towards me just to find out she planned to drag me into their bedroom. I, 21 female, am in an incredibly uncomfortable situation involving my best friend, Claire, 23 female, and her fiancé, James, 29 male. I really don't know how to handle this in the right way, and I could use some guidance. For context, let me explain how this all started. Claire and I met during my sophomore year of high school through some mutual acquaintances. From the very beginning, we hit it off and became inseparable. When she graduated, though, she moved several states away, which was heartbreaking for me. Despite the physical distance, we managed to maintain our close friendship by keeping in touch through phone calls, texts, and occasional visits. About 2 years ago, my family planned a vacation near Claire's new hometown. Naturally, we made plans to meet up. I was ecstatic to see her again, and the reunion was everything I hoped for. We ran to each other like we were in a movie, hugging and laughing. That evening, I also had the chance to meet James, her fiancé of 1 year. Claire had spoken so highly of him that I expected him to be a great guy, and at first, he seemed friendly and polite. Shortly after I returned home, I received a text message from an unfamiliar number. It turned out to be James, thanking me for visiting Claire. He mentioned how happy she had been and how much it meant to her. Understanding the struggles Claire had been going through, I thought it was sweet of him to acknowledge that. I assumed Claire had shared my number with him, so I didn't think much of it. After that, James started texting me occasionally. At first, the messages were innocent enough, questions about movies he and Claire planned to watch or recommendations for video games they had bought. I would respond briefly, keeping the conversation polite, but never allowing it to linger. However, James often tried to keep the chat going, which I found unnecessary since we weren't close. More than a year after meeting him, I received a late-night text from James saying, "I miss you." Confused, I assumed he had sent it to me by mistake and decided to ignore it. Fast forward to about a month ago, I had planned a weekend trip to visit Claire. I was beyond excited for some quality time with my best friend. But nothing could have prepared me for the bizarre and uncomfortable experience that followed. Claire and James picked me up at the airport, and almost immediately, James made me feel uneasy. When he hugged me in greeting, it lasted a little too long and felt far too intimate. Then, as he pulled away, he commented, "You look so hot." Not nice or pretty, he specifically said hot. I laughed awkwardly, glancing at Claire to see if she noticed, but she seemed distracted. I brushed it off as an awkward moment and tried to enjoy the day. For the most part, things went smoothly, though James kept bringing up the idea of all of us getting drunk later. I don't drink, so I declined politely. However, he continued to push the idea, making me increasingly uncomfortable. Eventually, he gave up when I didn't budge. That evening, back at their house, we relaxed in the family room watching TV. At some point, the conversation drifted to a pregnancy scare Claire had confided in me about a few months earlier. Out of nowhere, James launched into a rant, calling Claire stupid for worrying about it. His tone was loud and demeaning as he criticized her for forgetting her birth control and refused to take any responsibility. He even said it was bullshit that she expected him to wear a condom. I was stunned by his words and his complete lack of respect for Claire. I immediately defended her, saying it was entirely reasonable for her to be concerned about an unplanned pregnancy and that he should respect her preferences. James simply laughed at me, brushing off my response, while Claire stayed completely silent. Later, as I was getting ready to head to the guest room for the night, James made a bizarre suggestion. He asked if I wanted to sleep in bed with him and Claire instead of staying in the guest room. His tone made the offer even stranger. I declined immediately, feeling increasingly uneasy, and went to bed, trying to shake off the disturbing interaction. The next morning, Claire and I had plans to go shopping together. She mentioned that James wouldn't be joining us because he had to work, which came as a relief. Spending time alone with Claire felt like a much-needed break from the awkward tension James seemed to bring. However, just as we were about to leave the house, James stopped me in the hallway. He looked at me with a smirk and said, "You're a heavy sleeper." His comment caught me completely off guard. I frowned, confused, and asked him what he meant by that. With the same smirk, he added, "You're such a heavy sleeper. You don't even wake up when people touch you." At first, I thought he might be referring to something innocent, like trying to wake me up earlier by tapping my shoulder. But the way he emphasized the word touch and the smug look on his face made it feel far from harmless. My stomach churned. "What the hell are you talking about?" I snapped, glaring at him. James just laughed, brushing off my reaction. "It's nothing," he said casually before walking away as if nothing had happened. I felt sick. I do take strong sleeping pills, something Claire knows about, which often leave me deeply unconscious throughout the night. While I doubted anything had actually happened, the mere thought that James could have groped me in my sleep made me feel violated. Even if it was just a sick joke to mess with my head, the fact that he said it at all was enough to make my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off and focus on enjoying my time with Claire, but the outing didn't bring much comfort either. While we were stopped at a red light, we sat quietly watching pedestrians cross the street. Out of nowhere, Claire broke the silence. "That girl is so beautiful," she said, nodding toward a woman in the crowd. I glanced over and agreed. "Yeah, she's really pretty." Then, without any hesitation, Claire blurted out, "I'm not attracted to men." The words hung in the air, and I could almost feel the weight they carried. She said it with an intensity that suggested she'd been holding it in for years, waiting for the right moment to let it out. I stared at her, dumbfounded. "What?" was all I managed to say. Claire went on, explaining that she's a lesbian and doesn't love James. Her confession left me reeling. I had never once considered the possibility. Sure, she had briefly mentioned a fling with a girl back in middle school, but she'd always played it off as a phase or a cry for attention. We even laughed about it in the past. Now, I realized she might have been lying to herself and to me all along. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Before I could say anything, Claire admitted that she didn't want to marry James, but felt like it was what she should do. "Why on earth would you marry him if you don't love him?" I asked, genuinely confused and concerned. She didn't have much of an answer. Instead, she just said, "Can we drop it?" I really don't want to talk about this anymore. It was clear she wasn't ready to unpack everything, so I reluctantly let the subject go. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about how trapped she must feel. By the time we returned to the house, I was counting down the hours until my flight the next morning. When Claire mentioned that James would be joining us for dinner, my heart sank even further. That evening, as the three of us walked into the restaurant, I noticed James trailing behind me. Suddenly, I felt his hand brush dangerously close to my backside. I quickly stepped to the side, but James moved just as fast, clearly trying to grab me. Luckily, I managed to shift out of his reach, leaving him with only the barest touch of my skirt. "Watch your fucking hands," I snapped, glaring at him. But instead of apologizing, James laughed, completely unbothered. "I can't help it," he said casually, adding some crude comment about my appearance that I'd rather not repeat. The rest of the dinner dragged on painfully. I sat in silence, barely touching my food, while Claire chatted away as if nothing was wrong. I debated leaving and getting a hotel room for the night, but in the end, I convinced myself to stick it out for just one more evening. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. When we got back to Claire's place, I immediately told her how exhausted I was, hoping to call it a night. However, Claire insisted that we watch our favorite movie together before I left in the morning. Not wanting to seem rude, I reluctantly agreed, and the two of us went upstairs to her room. Since her roommate's bedroom was on the ground floor near the family room, watching the movie in her room was a considerate choice to avoid disturbing anyone. About an hour into the movie, James barged in without warning and asked if he could join us. Claire, without hesitation, told him he could. It had barely been 10 minutes since he settled in when James started making inappropriate suggestions, urging Claire and me to kiss. I felt disgusted and said no firmly, refusing even to look in his direction. Instead, I kept my eyes glued to the screen, hoping he would stop. Claire, however, didn't utter a single word. She sat there completely silent, as if nothing was happening. James didn't take the hint and began begging, practically pleading, for us to just kiss really quick. His tone was both irritating and unsettling. I finally snapped and told him to shut up, making it clear that he was ruining the movie. For a moment, I thought the tension would ease, but just a few minutes later, James crossed another line entirely. He outright asked if I wanted to sleep with him, speaking as though he genuinely believed I would find him irresistible. I was appalled and immediately shot him down, pointing out the obvious fact that Claire was sitting right beside me. I turned to her, expecting some kind of reaction, anything at all, but she just sat there, detached and emotionless, staring straight ahead as if she hadn't heard a word. Then, as if her silence gave him permission, James smugly informed me that Claire was okay with sharing him. I was in utter disbelief. He continued pressing me, demanding that I show some appreciation for letting me stay in their home. I couldn't believe the audacity. Turning to Claire in desperation, I asked her directly, "How the f*** are you okay with this?" But she still didn't react. Her blank expression and lifeless eyes made it seem like she wasn't even present in the moment. Feeling trapped and furious, I decided I needed to leave. As I got up, James stood in front of the door, physically blocking my way. I'm not a big person, barely 5 feet tall and weighing 100 pounds, and here I was, faced with a towering man determined to intimidate me. I told him firmly to move, but instead, he doubled down, saying again that I owed him. At that moment, I realized I had no choice. Gathering all the courage I could, I shoved past him, narrowly avoiding his attempt to grab me. I rushed downstairs, gathered my belongings as quickly as possible, and headed straight to a hotel. My heart was pounding the entire time, but I felt a small sense of relief once I was finally out of that house. The most shocking part of all of this? Claire didn't even acknowledge what had happened. She never said a word about it, even afterward. I can't shake the feeling that she's either being abused by James, suffering from some kind of mental health issue, or perhaps both. I feel terrible for being so angry at her, but I can't help it. I'm furious that she just sat there, doing nothing while James behaved so aggressively toward me. Claire knows about my past and how I was sexually assaulted not long ago, so she should understand how sensitive I am to unwanted advances. Yet, she stayed silent. Since that night, I've barely spoken to Claire. She doesn't seem to grasp why I've distanced myself. What complicates matters even further is that, by sheer coincidence, I've accepted an internship in a city close to where Claire and James live. Within a month, I'll be living near them, and I feel anxious about what to do. I'm torn. On one hand, I want to help Claire. I believe she's living a lie, pretending to be in love with James while hiding her true feelings and sexuality. On the other hand, I'm afraid of getting involved, especially if it means encountering James again. I have no idea how to navigate the situation, and I feel completely lost. Any advice on how I can support Claire while protecting myself and avoiding further conflict with James would be deeply appreciated. After everything that happened, I decided it was time to talk to Claire. My nerves were shot, and I had no idea how she would react, but I knew I had to do it. Claire had been there for me during some of the hardest moments in my life, and I wanted to be there for her too. I knew James was supposed to be working that evening. Claire often went with him and spent hours idly sitting around, which, in hindsight, should have struck me as odd. I didn't know if she would join him that night, so I sent her a message asking if she wanted to Skype. Her response was curt, "Why do you want to talk to me all of a sudden?" I apologized for being distant and said I wanted to catch up. She didn't reply immediately, but I waited, determined to speak with her. Later that evening, Claire agreed to the call, and I caught her alone. We made small talk for about a minute, but my nerves were too frayed to keep it up. I cut to the chase and explained why I'd been pulling away. I told her James's behavior was deeply troubling and listed every instance that had made me uncomfortable, emphasizing my concerns for her safety as well as my own. Claire stayed completely silent the entire time. I think she hadn't expected the conversation to go this way. When I finished, I asked her why she was willing to marry James, especially since she had admitted to me that she wasn't attracted to men. That's when Claire broke down and confessed something I never saw coming. She'd been in love with me since high school. I was stunned and couldn't find the words to respond. As some of you had suspected, Claire and James had been trying to orchestrate a threesome during my visit. I asked whose idea it had been, and Claire admitted it was hers. She explained that James had been thrilled with the suggestion and had promised to make it happen no matter what. They had planned the entire weekend with this goal in mind, hoping the intimacy would come about naturally. When it didn't, James took it upon himself to push the boundaries. I asked Claire why she tolerated James's coercive behavior. She said she felt desperate to be with me and believed this was her only chance. When I pressed further and asked if she was okay with the idea of forcing me into it, she hesitated and said, "Maybe, but you would have enjoyed it eventually." That made me feel physically sick. She claimed I would have likely just given in, and then she could join in if James had followed through. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I tried to stay calm. I told Claire gently that I didn't share her romantic feelings. I cared for her as a friend, but I couldn't see her that way. I also expressed concern for her well-being and safety, hoping to help her in some way. That's when her entire demeanor changed. Claire, who had always been passive and soft-spoken, exploded. She accused me of trying to steal James from her and shouted that I couldn't have him. She blamed James's advances and even my past sexual assault on me, claiming it was because of the way I dressed and presented myself. She said all of her insecurities stemmed from me because James constantly compared us, asking why she couldn't look or act more like me. Claire has always preferred baggy clothes and a natural appearance, while I enjoy dressing up and doing my makeup. It's never been an issue before, but now it was a point of contention. Her tirade ended with her telling me to kill myself. At that point, I couldn't take any more and hung up. I felt completely out of my depth. It was clear Claire was struggling with issues far beyond anything I could help with, and I couldn't keep trying. After the internship ended, I moved back home, far away from both Claire and James. During my time near them, they had tried reaching out multiple times. Claire sent messages acting as though nothing had happened, asking why I wouldn't respond. James, on the other hand, sent unsettling messages that included jokes about kidnapping me. I deleted every message without responding. During my internship, I only saw Claire and James once, and the encounter still makes me uneasy. It happened at a pop culture convention I'd been dying to attend. I was incredibly excited, even though I didn't have anyone to go with at first. Thankfully, I found a couple of girls through our internships group page on Facebook who were also looking for company. We planned to stick together and enjoy the event. I knew there was a good chance Claire and James would be there. They attended every year, and my costume wasn't exactly subtle. It was bold and eye-catching. I figured they would spot me easily, but I was determined not to let them ruin the experience. Before heading out, I gave the girls a quick explanation of the situation with Claire and James. They were incredibly supportive and promised to have my back. The convention started off wonderfully. I was standing in line for an autograph with one of the girls when, out of nowhere, I felt someone hug me from behind. My stomach dropped, and I immediately flailed to get free. It was James. He stepped back, pretending to look confused, while Claire stood silently beside him. She didn't say a word. I wish I could say I confronted him with confidence, but fear took over. I froze for a moment and then bolted. In my towering heels, running wasn't exactly an option, so I did that awkward fast-walking shuffle, crouching slightly to keep my balance. I probably looked ridiculous, but at that moment, all I cared about was getting away. A couple of the girls from my group followed me to make sure I was okay, which I really appreciated. I didn't see Claire or James again for the rest of the convention. That encounter cemented my decision to distance myself completely. I know some people advised me not to cut Claire out of my life entirely, but after everything, I just don't feel safe around either of them. Claire is clearly dealing with issues far beyond anything I can help her with, and my own well-being has to come first. Needless to say, I'm not attending their wedding. I've accepted that our friendship, as painful as it is to lose, can't continue under these circumstances. I'm deeply grateful for all the advice and support I received from everyone here. It's helped me feel more confident in prioritizing my safety and moving forward.